Hey everyone, welcome to the video. In this video, I'm going to talk about the frame problem, and the frame problem relates to values, morality, belief systems, and individuals' ability to perceive the world and individual relationships being able to exist in some sort of harmony. So, what is the frame problem? The frame problem emerged in the 1970s in the field of artificial intelligence, and the frame problem essentially says, given that there's a near infinite amount of information in the world, what framework of value do you overlay onto this vast environment so that way you can make sense of it? Some researchers thought that you might be able to investigate all of the information around you in some sort of serial or algorithmic manner to understand whether or not it is relevant for whatever it is that you're doing. But again, given that there's just so much information, this implies that there's some sort of a priori frame that gets used to constrain what is relevant and what is irrelevant. And so a framework of value is essentially a list of priorities. It's a mechanism of prioritization. The frame problem explicitly manifested in the 1970s, but implicitly, I think it has a history that goes back at least 100 years, back to, let's say, the 1870s with the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that God is dead and we have killed him. And this was a famous proclamation of the death of God. And part of what he meant by that, I think, is that up until that point, there was a heavy religious tradition in the West that gave individuals their values. Many people in the West, up until that point, had a specifically, let's say, Christian traditional worldview that organized all of the information in their environment. And so the cybernetic frame was a set of values that were passed down through the Judeo-Christian tradition. But for many reasons, one of them being the search for truth, Western culture elevated more enlightenment values in a more scientific and rational worldview that dispensed with many of the moral traditions of religion. And Nietzsche predicted that with the death of God would come two manifestations. One would be nihilism, as the Western man tried to figure out his new values, or as he tried to understand where his morality came from. And while he's wandering in the desert without a framework, the chaos of everything manifested itself to him. And that's a good way to think about nihilism. Without a framework of value, everything is either important or everything's unimportant. And so it's very difficult to know how to act and to derive a purpose or a meaning from your life if you don't have a frame of value that tells you what's relevant in the first place. So without a framework of value, with the death of God, one pathway is nihilism. Another pathway is the search for another framework of value, and Nietzsche thought specifically that it would be some sort of totalitarian, materialistic socialism that would take the place of God. And from my research, both of those things happened in the 20th century. Dostoevsky, a famous Russian novelist, had a similar pattern of thinking, and I think it's best expressed in his book Demons, or another title of it is The Possessed, where Dostoevsky writes about the tension between an older and younger generation based around the 1860s or 1870s in Russia, where you had a younger generation of atheistic, materialistic, rationalists, socialists who were seeking a utopian world where everyone had enough of everything all of the time, essentially. And without giving away too many spoilers, many of Dostoevsky's characters in demons act out the value hierarchies or the frameworks of value of someone who's an atheist or someone who's a nihilist or someone who is a utopian. And none of those characters end up with an outcome that the average person today, the average modern man, would desire. And so you had Nietzsche, who said that the death of God would bring about nihilism and totalitarianism. You had Dostoevsky, who essentially said the same thing. And then within the field of cybernetics, over the next few decades, going into the 1970s, you also had this implicit idea that for human beings, which are cybernetic creatures, to exist, we needed a framework of value that helped us organize our perceptions and helped us derive meaning from the world. So one question manifests: if you accept what I just laid out, what is the most adaptive framework of value? If no framework of value leads you to a meaningless pit of nihilism, and if, as we saw with, let's say, Nazi Germany or Maoist China or Stalin's Russia, Stalin's Soviet Union, frameworks of value predicated on, let's say, ethnic purity or a communist materialistic utopia, if those also lead to genocide or maladaptive outcomes, just things that people don't want, the question becomes, well, what is the correct path forward, and what is the adaptive mode of behavior that would be implied in the adoption of an adaptive framework of value? And currently in my investigations, I think that Carl Jung was correct in his assertions and what is essentially his response to Nietzsche's death of God, although you might not put it that way explicitly. If Nietzsche thought that human beings would need to create their own values in response to the death of God, Jung thought that human beings would need to rediscover our values in the archetypal narratives and symbols of the collective unconscious. And as I'm trying to go down that path, as I think it's right, I just think that there are some examples that make that case clear. But I actually don't want to go into that in this video. What I wanted to talk about more so is just trying to ground this idea of having a framework of value and trying to figure out what the framework of value is into the individual psyche, into the individual's life practically. And one of the examples that I just thought about comes from interpersonal relationships and people's social lives. Personally, I've experienced having arguments with people where it's not productive. And I've also experienced having debates and dialogues with people where it's playful and it's enthusiastic, and I feel like I learned a lot. I would say in marriages particularly, different frameworks of value can lead to either arguments that are pathological and unproductive and very stressful, and then there are frameworks of value that lead to more productive conversations. So you can imagine a couple who fights, let's say, 2 or 3 times a week, and the fights are always over the same issues. Someone didn't do the dishes, someone didn't take the trash out, someone didn't get food, or someone didn't, text on time. They're always the same issues. And what might characterize the way in which those partners are viewing the world is that their ultimate aim might be, instead of learning and trying to make the relationship work, they want to argue so that way they can win. And so their aim is to dominate the other person. And the person's aim is very similar to their framework of value, right? Once you set your goal, then the world manifests itself to you in terms of how you can accomplish that goal, or how the world will generate obstacles that get in your way. And so your highest aim is the same thing as your framework of value. So if your aim is to prove your dominance and to win an argument when you're talking with your partner, that conversation is not going to be very helpful. Instead of trying to understand the other person, you're going to be focused on maybe insulting them or laughing at them or demeaning them. And then the other person's just going to do the same thing to you, or they won't respond appropriately. Instead of trying to be honest with you and communicate with you, they might get defensive and then they're going to start doing the same thing to you. And so that framework of value of an individual who's in a relationship, in a marriage, wanting to dominate the other person is not helpful. Now we can juxtapose that with another framework of value. And this could be one where the central aim is to create a marriage where both people are enthusiastically engaged every day and in every interaction. And you can set that as the ideal, and sometimes you might fall short of that ideal, but what's important is that the aim plays a major role in determining how the conversation will go. And you can have the same conversation. It could be about dishes, it can be about chores, it can be about money, but the aim just plays a major the aim plays a major role in how the conversation will play itself out. And so instead of aiming at trying to dominate the other person, you can imagine aiming at trying to be truthful and trying to understand the other person, so that way each person can modify their behavior, so that way the marriage game is more fun for each person. And that conversation might look a lot different. It might be characterized by a more calm tone, or it might be, hopefully there's a lot less insults, and hopefully there's a lot less aggressiveness, and there's more questioning, and there's more pausing, and there's more active listening. And so hopefully that gets the point across that in many of your experiences, to the degree that things aren't going as well as you would like them to go, whether it's at your job or when it comes to fitness or when it comes to your personal relationships, one of the questions that you can ask yourself is, do I have the proper framework of value? Do I have the correct aim that orients my perceptions and my actions? And it might be that if you change your framework of value, things might turn out better for you, or you might at least see how you could make things better in the long run. So, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.